My name is Richard Lemen. I'm one of the co-science directors of ADAO, and we welcome all of you again to this conference today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the most commonly used asbestos fiber and talk to you about what has been said and what is being said about this fiber. Is this really the safe fiber? Or is it the safe fiber because some say so? Now, I just need, here. No. Well, there we go. Chrysotile was discovered in Quebec in 1847 and 1860. We started using it and using it commercially by the late 1800s, and from two areas in Thetford. And this is one of the open pit mines that you can see here with the children sitting at the viewing booth looking at it. We also mine chrysotile underground, and these are, and I just hit the wrong button, sorry for the, there. And as you can see, there's one with a respirator. The second man doesn't have one, but I guess the person closest to the face of the mine is in more need than the other, but you'll see this quite often in asbestos. And I want to talk a little bit about the geology. Here's a young geologist from Canada, from Quebec Mining Association, learning about the different fibers. But chrysotile makes up about 95% of all of the asbestos used, with the amphiboles making up about 5%. We'll talk more about the importance of this in a minute, but to look a little bit, the serpentine, which is chrysotile, they're curved fibers with a hollow center. They're mined principally in Canada, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Russia. And the amphiboles, on the other hand, are straight and more spear-like. So they're not as useful for weaving into textiles and other materials that the chrysotile is. The chrysotile coming out of the mine is actually found in veins, and when it comes out of the mine, the rock is crushed, and these veins then yield the fiber, as you see here, from the veins where the materials are then crushed again more and used. Now, the backgrounds that I've got for these slides, I want to give you a little bit of the significance of these. All of these backgrounds are on places where asbestos has been found in the past. So here we have acoustical plaster. I'm not going to explain all of these as I go through, but when you see a picture, this is a material where asbestos has been found. Not found, but used. Let us start with some early history. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company set up a Department of Industrial Hygiene at McGill University, and the clinical director said there were no abnormalities of significance found and no cases of pneumoconiosis. That's what they called asbestosis before they named it in 1927 as asbestosis. Pneumoconiosis meaning dust disease of the lung. But the Metropolitan Insurance records show a different picture. They found claims from Thetford mines and found a predominance of lung disorders. And you can get more information by looking at Dr. Castleman's book, as well as Morris Greenberg's recent paper that goes into this in much more detail. I'm stealing from them to tell you the story, so I hope they don't mind. Asbestos becomes a major marketing. By the 1940s, it was taking off, and as you can see, the world production kept going up while the U.S. production went up and started coming off and coming down by the 1980s. But look at the world production. 1980, 1990, it's still a major product, even though it's starting to come down in some areas. Now let us talk about the scientists, or the alchemists, or the devil's doctor. We'll decide after we look at this what we want to call the various people in this show. But the alchemist takes a few things of hope, fast luck, create a little doubt, a little creativity, throws it in with some chrysotile asbestos, and then we obscure the facts. Now, I'm not just saying this. I'm going to show you how this is true. The Johns Manville Company in 1940 in Quebec, the medical officer looked at the world's literature over the past 40 years and claimed there were really no serious effects from asbestos, even though his own study reported an excess of asbestosis in those with greater than 10 years of exposure. But he concluded there was no case of asbestos found because the findings that he had were irrelevant because they came without a case history or a physical examination. This was the type of thing that we were seeing in the literature at this time. Well, my thing just quit. Maybe you want me to quit. In 1945, the wives of the miners started getting concerned that their husbands were getting sick, and they went to a council meeting, a local council meeting, around the mining communities, and they were promised that the Quebec Asbestos Association, as well as the Provincial Department of Health and the County Bureau of Hygiene and the Philip Carey Company, who was the owners of the mine, would do something and resolve this. However, nothing ever happened. They were just left with the promise with no fulfillment. In 1948 at Thedford, remember there are two mining districts, the Thedford Mining District and the Asbestos, the city of Asbestos. By the way, just an aside, I noticed on the web the city of Asbestos is trying to change their name. They don't like the name asbestos anymore, so it may not be called that, but if you want a little interesting fact, there's a story about it on the internet. Anyhow, medical textbooks, this common one by R.T. Johnstone, was reporting that the Thedford medical officers were stating that these people do not suffer from asbestosis. Here again in the East Brompton, Quebec in 1949, Dr. Ledoux had reported the hazards of asbestos in North American mining had been well known for 15 years. However, what did the Canadian Medical Association say? And what did the government of Canada say? That they're wrong, and these reports are wrong, and they're still saying that today. 1952, we had 2 cases of pleural mesothelioma that Dr. Cartier talked about coming out of the mines in Canada. We go forward and we see that in 55, Cartier also reported 128 cases of asbestosis. And look at this statement. Dr. Cartier, after reporting this, says, more frequently, asbestosis remains a disease which can be tolerated quite well for many years. This disease may look more serious and cause important medical legal problems if a too scientific medical concept or a too liberal social interpretation is accepted by medical legal professions, labor, and compensation bodies. Now, the Thedford medical officer informs a British physician that's visiting, and the physician writes a memo about the 126 cases and with pleural plaques, and 93% of those had signs of asbestos. But what happened to the memo? It was kept confidential. Then we have 2 studies, Rossiter showing a high prevalence of abnormal radiological findings, and Gibbs showing a markedly higher prevalence of pleural calcification among workers in the Thedford mine. And here we have the results of the epidemiological study of the giant cohort that has been studied by the McGill University group for many, many years, showing that the excess mortality was greater in the Thedford mine area than it was in the asbestos mine area. 1993, they continued looking this, finding it greater, but all of a sudden an idea pops up. What was that idea? Well, they sent it back to the alchemist to look at it and see why these increases were occurring, and particularly why there was a difference in one area versus the other area. And what did they find? They went through the medical literature, as you can see down here, and they found an article written by Dr. Elms, and it talks about the significance of the low amphibole exposure in predominantly chrysotile mixes was not appreciated until the studies of fibers of the lung using the electron microscope showed the high burden of amphibole fibers in the 70s and 80s. Now, what does that mean? Reviewing the current evidence, went on to state, it seems likely that chrysotile uncontaminated with tremolite may not have caused any mesotheliomas, even at the high cumulative lifetime exposures. What a revolutionary finding. They blamed it on the tremolite. It's a contaminant of less than 1% in most of the ore series that we see. So if we can produce and mill out the tremolite, we can sell the 95% of the chrysotile, and it'll be a safe asbestos. Well, oops, what happened? Dr. Bignon and his colleagues in France, as I reported in a paper that I wrote, found that while it was 7 times higher in Thedford, and we're talking about mesothelioma at this point in time, than it was in the town of Asbestos, when you look at the proportion of the mining population in Thedford and the proportion of the mining population in Asbestos, you can see the proportion was not that much difference. So there we go with the tremolite theory, but it didn't take it out because they went to a new thing. They continued looking at lung burden. Well, what's wrong with looking at lung burden? The problem with looking at lung burden is when you use traditional methods, such as the phase contrast microscope, which is generally used, you miss the chrysotile. The resolution is not great enough, and you miss the chrysotile. The only way you really get into the chrysotile is you have to go to the transmission electron microscope. So we use lung burden. We still promote this theory that it's the tremolite and not the chrysotile. Well, what happens? Let's talk about biopersistence for a second. Chrysotolite, which is an amphibole, tremolite, which is an amphibole, they don't clear from the lung. Remember, they were the long, sharp fibers that were solid in the middle as compared to the chrysotile, which with a hollow in the middle, they break down and they clear from the lung. Well, where's the mesothelioma occur? It doesn't occur in the lung. It occurs in the pleura. And so how does that happen? Is it because there's such a lung burden that these fibers are causing a disease outside the lung? I don't think so. And the same with the peritoneum. Why is asbestos that's got a high concentration in the lung causing disease in the peritoneum? Well, what happens? Well, when we look at animal studies, and this is a friendly little rat that I've tried to show that if you look at the chrysotile, 99.92% of the chrysotile is gone. And what remains are these short little fibers that aren't measured by the phase contrast microscope. So if the chrysotile gets out of the lung, what's happening to it? But the other scientists are saying it's the amphiboles in the lung that are causing the disease outside the lung. These translocations take a long time to occur, and a lot of things affect it, such as inflammation, increased interstitial flow resistances. But if you look at what some of our pathologists are seeing, and this is from Dr. Suzuki and the group at Mount Sinai, when you look at the pleural area where the disease is occurring, what do you find? In the lung, you find a high content of amphibole. But when you look outside in the mesothelial tissues, what do you find? 30.3 times more common chrysotile being in that area than are the amphiboles. And what size are they? They're the small fibers that are getting through. We also know that fibers translocate all throughout the rest of the body. We've found fibers in the urine. We find it in other parts of the body. So this translocation may be very important. And where did we find a lot of this? First in the animals, but Dr. Craighead in Vermont and Brooke Mossman in the New England Journal of Medicine say much current debate centers around the question of whether all types of asbestos possess the capacity to induce mesothelioma. Their conclusion, experiments in animals yield an affirmative answer, and I would say what we're seeing pathologically today is yielding an affirmative answer. I did a paper a few years ago, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I took a epidemiological criteria and looked at 9 different criteria that Dr. Hill, Bradford Hill, a statistician in England, talked about in 1965. And he said you didn't have to meet all of these to show general causation. But these are things an epidemiologist should take into consideration, such as plausibility, coherence, strength of association, consistency of the observation, association, biological gradient, experimental information, analogy, and specificity of the association and temporality. Well, let us look at a few of these. Consistency. These are all chrysotile, where we're seeing excesses of disease occurring. And it's very consistent, not just in Canada, but we're seeing it in Italy, Zimbabwe, Louisiana, Germany. We're seeing it in England, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. I could go on further and further. We are seeing it in people that have had developing mesothelioma and other asbestos-related diseases in these professions. And I could go on, but the point is that it is a consistent finding with people exposed to chrysotile. Here we look at laboratory experiments. What do they tell us? Well, let's compare them. Let's look at amosite, crucidolite, the 2 main amphibole fibers that are commercially used, and chrysotile. Look at this. Each of them cause cellular damage, genetic damage, animal fibrosis, animal cancer, animal mesothelioma, human asbestosis, human cancer, and human mesothelioma. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the details, but you can read in my paper, which was in the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health in 2004, more detail. But in summing this up, I just want to show that we do have a lot of data. And from IARC, we see that when it causes cancer in animals, this is a good indicator that it's going to cause cancer in humans, particularly when you look at the route of entry and you look at the type of exposure. What about the analogy? Well, if the amphiboles can cause disease, and they make up less than 5% of commercial use, why can't the chrysotile fibers? Now, I will grant that in chrysotile, we generally see from epidemiology and the animal studies that on a dose-by-dose basis, chrysotile seems to be less potent in causing mesothelioma. However, there is no study that I can point to that clearly demonstrates that chrysotile does not cause all of the asbestos-related diseases, including asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, and gastrointestinal cancers. So what is driving this? It may be more than science. But what is asbestos? And it's important for this audience to remember that we're not talking just about mesothelioma. That's the most devastating in some cases of the diseases, but also just as devastating is suicide. I did a study back in the 1970s where we found a strong excess of suicide in a chrysotile plant in Mannheim, Pennsylvania. And when we looked at the suicides, most of them were suffering an asbestos-related disease. And as Dr. Selikoff, who many of you may remember from Mount Sinai, used to describe the asbestos patient, this is a person that walks upstairs backwards because they have to get their breath at every other step. Keep in mind, we're not talking just about mesothelioma. keep in mind, we are in a fight not to prove that asbestos causes just a few diseases. It affects people in many, many different ways. Through the suicides, the cor pulmonale, which is an enlargement of the right side of the lung, the asbestosis. Now the asbestos warts, you may say, what's that? Well, it's an irritation and you get it in your skin. But there are many different things that asbestos can do to an individual, and it can destroy the individual as well as the families. Well, over 40 different countries have recognized that chrysotile, as well as the other fiber types, can cause disease, and they have banned it. This country has not banned asbestos. It hasn't banned it. We've had a bill in the Senate that was passed last year to ban it, and at the late hour, Washington talk, at a minute till midnight, they changed it. What I testified to about banning was not what came out. What Linda Reinstein testified to banning was not what came out. What Dr. Miller testified to banning was not what came out. What Dr. Castleman testified to did not come out. What came out was a bill that exempted everything that was less than 1%. What does that mean? Well, it means Libby, Montana and W.R. Grace could just keep operating the way they were operating, and we'd still be having the vermiculite contaminated with tremolite. Most of the products that contain asbestos today contain it less than 1%. So by limiting that, the ban bill was nothing more than a word that said ban asbestos. We're working with ADAO. We're working very closely with the House of Representatives now. Both Linda and I testified a month ago to try and get this changed in the House. I don't know if we'll be successful, but if any of you have any input, what we want is a total ban bill. And all of these other agencies, NIOSH, IARC, National Toxicology Program, the World Trade Association, the ILO, the World Health Organization, the Surgeon General, have come to the same conclusion that all types of asbestos, including chrysotile, cause asbestos-related diseases. And with that, I would say that ADAO is here to say we support a complete ban on all forms of asbestos. And I know I've gone over this literature very quickly. I had 20 minutes, and I may have gone over that too. But in any case, if there's any message to go away, it's all types of asbestos that are dangerous, not just the amphiboles. Don't listen to the propaganda coming out of Russia, Canada, Zimbabwe, and Lori can tell you many more places that tell you chrysotile is safe and can be used safely. In my travels throughout the world, looking at developing countries, which are the main target of the chrysotile producers today, they don't use it properly. They say that it can be used under controlled situations. Well, the biggest control I've ever seen is no control. And I think that there might be pictures of others that show you that it's not being used under controlled situations. It's a danger. We need to ban its use in this country. With that, I'll thank you.